Hello, this is Chris Heasley with the Chris Heasley Radio Show. And today we're going to talk about weather modification and the hill country, the Texas hill country floods. When I was a child, the word was not conspiracy theory. The word was urban legend. And there was no shaming that came along with considering an urban legend, right? So you wouldn't hear these stories on the corporate media, but people would pass these stories around from person to person in our society in the 1980s. And again, we would talk about this stuff openly. Urban legends, we talk about it. There was no sort of shaming or, any sort of, accusatory position against people when we were talking this stuff. It was just open. We talked about it. We didn't necessarily believe urban legends, but we considered it, and we found them fascinating. And there were a whole bunch of urban legends. And so many of them are coming true today, these stories that we heard back in the 1980s when I was a child. But one story that I heard when I was a child was that the Russians were, I was told this when I was a child in the 1980s, that the Russians were manipulating weather to create thunderstorms for the purposes of weather weapons. I was told this in the 1980s, and I remember just thinking, that will never work. But that just gives you an idea of where we were back then. And but here we are today, and so many of these things are coming true, and so we have to give them a second look. And on today's show, like I said, we're going to talk about weather modification and the Texas hill country floods, and see if, just put it out there, just see if there's any relationship between those two ideas. And on today's show, we have two guests on today's show. We have Joseph Olsen. Joseph, how are you doing today?
Getting a lot better. I was kind of ill this summer.
Yeah, Joseph was out with pneumonia for some time, but we're glad to have you back.
I'm glad to be back.
And on the phone, calling in, we have G2. G2, are you there?
I am.
Okay, great. It's good to hear you. But let's jump right into it, guys. And Joseph, so I know you've prepared some stuff for tonight. Tell us, what you know about the ability for the government to manipulate weather.
Well, first of all, weather is the final trailing artifact of a number of different forces that are at work in the universe. And we live in a universe that's profoundly indifferent to the existence of human beings or of living things. A perfect example was we have what's called the Malkovich cycle, where you have 100,000 years of ice ages, 10,000 years of interglacial, 100,000. We happen to be at the trailing end of the interglacial, which started with the Holocene about 12,000 years ago. At that point, Canada was covered with a mile-thick ice sheet, and the ocean levels were 400 feet lower than they are today.
Was the whole world frozen 11,000 years ago during the Holocene?
Yes, both poles were frozen, far more than they were now. And then,
so the globe was basically an ice sheet.
Right.
This was 11,000 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Right. And then there was a starting of a thaw, and so things started thawing out a little bit. And then there was a giant asteroid that hit the ice sheet in Canada. It didn't leave a crater because it splattered ice chunks all the way down into the Carolinas and all the way over into North Dakota. Those are called Carolina Bays, where you have these horseshoe-shaped depressions that have a mound on one side, and they all point back to this central location in Canada.
And does that serve as the evidence of the? Is there any evidence of this? That's the
asteroid? Evidence, because some of them contain asteroid fragments, meteorite fragments, as well as the ice. But what that did was cause enormous climate change, and it killed all of the large mammals in the North American continent, which was mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed tigers, the 600-pound dire wolves, which you can imagine what a wolf being 600 pounds.
I'd love it if those things were still alive today. That would be incredible.
Well, it'd be fun to go to Jurassic Park too, but I don't want to play with them.
Right.
Yeah, the saber-tooth. You want to see what they look like? Go to the La Brea Tar Pit Museum in Los Angeles on Wilshire Boulevard, and it's still bubbling tar today, but they've got thousands of skeletons from animals that got caught in the tar pit. But bottom line is, over a real short period of time, giant sloths, which were like 15 feet tall, all of these animals went extinct at that particular time. And so just to give you an idea, what man can do is tinker around the edges. What other forces can do is completely unbelievable. And like I said, it's profoundly indifferent.
So you're saying that any manipulation that man can do or that government can do is very minor compared to the natural evolution of the Earth.
That's correct. And so basically, we've got a whole bunch of physics involved in the planet circulating around the sun. We've got 210 million cubic miles of ocean that are absorbing sunlight and evaporating off, taking energy off of the surface of the oceans and lakes, going up into the clouds, reflecting sunlight back into the clouds, evaporating off the bottom of the clouds where it's the warmest, going up and condensing, which is releasing that energy. And so bottom line is we've got this natural refrigeration cycle in the atmosphere, and what they figured out how to do was be able to manipulate high pressure and low pressure cells using radio waves to heat up the ionosphere. And when
real quick, who's they?
Portions of our government, it's conjunction with Air Force, NOAA, DOD. They're all heavily involved in doing this.
So our government figured out how to heat up our ionosphere.
Correct.
And real quick, for the audience, what is the ionosphere?
That's the upper part of the atmosphere.
Okay, so, and they figured out how to heat up that part or everything up to that part?
Well, that's what they do. They can use selected radio frequencies, and they can direct the radio frequency at a particular air mass. And air, when you heat it up, it expands. I don't know if you've ever taken a half-empty soda bottle and put it in the refrigerator and you see how it crinkles up.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's highly expansive. And so if you heat up the ionosphere, you can create a high-pressure cell, and the high-pressure cell is capable of pushing the air around it. And so it's able to steer currents. So you're able to steer like hurricanes, and you can hold them in a position where they're over warm water so that you can build a hurricane up in strength. You are able to position them over an area like, say, Houston during Harvey, where you had 10,000 square miles that got 44 inches of rain across the whole entire area in a 48-hour period.
Okay, real quick. They heat up the ionosphere, and that creates the storm, or that directs the storm?
It directs the storm, and it's also able to amplify the storm. But to my knowledge, they're not able to seed the storm. The storms are seeded from dust clouds, and they're seeded in the warm waters of the storms that we get in the central part of the United States.
So when they want to create these natural disaster events for whatever political purposes, are they just sitting back waiting for a storm to create on its own, and then they amplify it and direct it? Is that what happens?
That's what it appears to be able to do.
Okay.
So, anyhow, and the first weather modifications was done in the 1890s. They were firing cannons and using balloons and using silver nitrate to seed clouds. And silver nitrate is real small molecule that allows water to condense around it. So you put that up in moist air, and next thing you know, you can start forming clouds, and then the clouds will get large enough that it can actually start dropping rain.
Real quick, you said this in the 1890s they started figuring this stuff out?
That's when they first started using silver nitrate for that particular purpose.
Do they shoot it up in the air? Is that how they do it? Or
that's how they did back then. But then during the Vietnam War, we had what was called Operation Popeye. And this went from October 1966 until October 1972, where they seeded clouds over Laos and the southern part of North Vietnam in order to make the Ho Chi Minh Trail unable
unbearable
to travel. Yeah, it was like just made it into a mud trough.
Yeah.
And so...
See, that's what I remember when I was a child, the Vietnam War vets coming home and saying that our government was dropping monsoons on the Vietnamese army. Our soldiers were saying that, our returning veterans. And yeah, go ahead. Huh?
And then they had the church hearings on all the nasty stuff that the CIA had been up to. And in the church hearings, which was declassified in 1974, they, and this is according to Seymour Hersh, in hearings in 1975 is when they disclosed that, yes, they were using silver nitrate, they were seeding the clouds, they were successful, and they did it for years.
Okay, what year was the church hearings?
74 and 5.
So they admitted to Operation Popeye in 74, 75 right away?
Oh, they admitted to a whole bunch of stuff. That's when they admitted to the heart attack gun.
Okay, one thing at a time. So one of the things I remember is seeing a Democrat senator, speaking out against weather weapons because of these events. And then also on top of that, there was actually an international convention of all of the major powers came together in Europe to have a council to prevent weather weapon usage. Now, what happened is that they stopped doing that, and to me, it looks like what they did is they kind of got an idea of how they could use it to their benefit, and they became opportunistic, and they changed that international council to global warming and climate change councils, where they would come together, the World Climate Change Summit, where they would come together and tell us all that we're bad because we're driving cars and cars are creating these storms. That's what I think they did.
Oh yeah, and it's part of a calculated, well thought out program where they're going to demonize hydrocarbon fuels, which, like I mentioned, the La Brea tar pit, hydrocarbons have been bubbling out of the planet continuously for 1 billion years, and it's going to continue for another 1 billion years, maybe not at the same rate, but that's only because there's a certain amount that's stored, but there's a certain amount that's being constantly produced. And I think we talked about that in a previous program.
Okay, real quick, I want to keep going down this road that you're going into. I know you have a whole notebook there filled that you're going to fill us up with content. I want to stay on that path, but real quick, I want to get G2. G2, you were a young man in the 1970s. Do you remember this Operation Popeye, or do you remember the Vietnam veterans coming home and talking about how our government was seeding creating monsoons?
I do not remember veterans talking about it, but I'm certainly aware of the effort to go ahead and seed the clouds over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, making it impassable, and that the military denied that for many, many years, and then finally they were forced to admit it being true. So they committed perjury for years, denying that operation was happening, and then they finally had to admit.
Yeah, our government lied to us. And then and by the way, again, that shaming tactic came in when we would begin to talk about these rumors. They would wag their finger at us, call us bad people, and call us conspiracy theorists. That was the whole reason that word was created. It's a word that really has it's a meaningless term. It's just a name. They're just name calling people so that we shut up. They don't want us to know. So not only did they commit perjury, but they also sort of coerced us into not believing it or talking about it by ostracizing us. But really, really sick stuff that our own government did. Joseph, you're up.
There's a bigger narrative picture that you've drawn here, which is clear. You know, you're talking about the mile-thick ice sheets that covered Indiana, Ohio, other parts, and all the way up into Canada that just disappeared 11,000 years ago. And yet we're told that it's, again, the V8 engine and the industrial age that changed the planet. And the climate apparently was stable until we started consuming hydrocarbon fuels. And they're not fossil fuels, to be clear. There weren't enough dinosaurs to create millions and millions of barrels of oil that were deposited in massive reservoirs underneath the crust. So the reality is the climate has always changed, and it's gone from extreme cold to extreme warm. There were ferns and other plants growing on the poles at one time. You know, and so this whole lie that CO2 somehow is changing the environment, it ignores all the facts about the content of CO2 in the atmosphere and the impact of that. And it's all been done just to create this story that convinces people in the free countries, in the Western nations, to surrender their rights and pay more taxes, because we're told if we don't yield our freedoms and pay more to the government, we're all going to die from carbon. So just putting sort of that whole picture together, right? Yes, the climate is changing. It has always been changing. It always will change. And the extreme variation in the climate has nothing to do with human beings. One volcano can produce as many pounds of CO2 as humans have in all of human history. So I think it's important to take what you've said and just sort of put that concept around it.
Yeah, I think the other profit motive they have is they want to take control of the oil, that natural resource itself. I think the political class wants to have that under their own name.
In 1910, there was an explosion in the eastern part of Russia, and because it was an inaccessible area, it took a long time for people to get there, but there's like 10,000 square miles of trees that were all blown down, and they were going in there with dog sleds, and after they'd start to make camp, the dogs would go over and start tearing away at stuff that was buried in the ice. And buried in the ice, they found frozen saber-toothed tigers, frozen rhinoceroses, and frozen mastodons. And the crazy thing about the mastodons is that they were frozen standing up with broken femurs and broken backbones, and they had undigested dandelions, which are semi-tropical vegetation, in their stomach. So the only thing that could account for that was that they were hit by a massive storm of bowling ball-sized hail that landed fast enough that it was able to keep the mastodons from falling over. They were flash frozen standing up, and they're still able to get DNA from those animals that were killed 10,000 years ago. And you can look that up anytime you want to about the Siberian rhinos, saber-toothed tigers, and mastodons, because it's pretty interesting. So, you want to talk about climate change. There's some pretty rapid climate change right there from an aerial burst of a meteorite that there's never been found anything on the ground. It hit and exploded in the atmosphere, and that's how much change happened at that same time. It could have been that asteroid was one that was left over from when the one that hit the Canadian ice sheet, but that just tells you that the one that hit the Canadian ice sheet was massive, and it certainly affected everything in the northern hemisphere.
Let's go back on track on, earlier I took you off track, but I want to hear back on track, weather modification.
Okay, yes. Peter Thiel, who's the one that was from the PayPal fortune, insider with multi-billion dollars, he started a company several years ago with $25 million of seed money to do cloud seeding. And the little kid that's in charge of it admitted that they had been doing cloud seeding for a week in central Texas before the rainstorm started. He said, but we stopped 2 days before it started. Well, I don't know what the dwell time is for silver nitrate in the atmosphere. It's a small enough molecule. It can probably stay floating in the atmosphere for a long period of time. And as it starts collecting rain, then yes, that certainly could have been one method of concentrating additional rainfall at that particular location. But the hill country's always been subject to flash flooding because you have pretty thin surface soils, you have a limited amount of infiltration of rainwater into the ground, absorption, and so what happens is when you have a little bit of slope, then it doesn't stay on the ground, it rolls down into the valleys, and then it concentrates, and it's real easy. I was in Bastrop back in 2014 when they had a big flood, and it was only about a 6 or 8 inch flood, but it flooded almost all the way up to Bergstrom Air Force Base, which is currently the city airport for Austin, and the road going into Austin, Highway 71, was 15 feet deep. And so that's what happens when you hit in a hill country area, it concentrates it. Well, the Camp Mystic, which had the highest death toll of any one particular location, was built in 1924. And it had never had a flood of that particular level. But it should have been something that was easily avoidable. And our state legislature...
Okay, hold that thought if I may, Joseph, because I want you talked about a lot of stuff there. Apologize. The content you're bringing the audience is rich, and I got to slow down a little bit just because it's so, it's a lot to digest. G2, do you remember, did you hear about this Peter Thiel company cloud seeding 2 days before? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so the first stories that came out were that there was no weather modification going on around the region that this Camp Mystic and these floods happened in. And then as it became clear that there were, in fact, planes aloft that were seeding the clouds, this young guy, this 25-year-old, who we're supposed to believe somehow created this cloud seeding company, I don't know, while he was in elementary school or something. This unlikely character started doing the rounds on podcasts and news programs saying, yes, we were seeding clouds in that area, but as you said, we stopped 2 days before the floods came, therefore we had no impact. And I agree. First of all, I haven't seen any evidence that they stopped 2 days before, and secondarily, I'm not sure how they can claim that they were seeding clouds to get rain. The rains came, and somehow they weren't involved. It certainly begs additional investigation and review of documentation of where they were seeding, how they were seeding, the impact of seeding, and a deep exploration of whether there is any connection between that company's activities and the flash floods that occurred immediately following their actions. It's just ridiculous that we get these simplistic answers and then it all disappears.
Yeah, we'll just take his word for it, G2. It's good enough for me, right?
Yeah, a bunch of dead kids, we'll take his word for it.
Yeah, I got to say one thing. We're told that this young kid's a whiz kid. And we're told the same thing about Elon Musk, when really Elon Musk created a software company. That's great. That's incredible. I know a lot of people that have done that. They're intelligent people, but they aren't, reiteration of Tesla, of Nicholas Tesla, like we make him out to be. All he really is, he had one software company and then he just became a government contractor. That's all he did. All he does is government contracts. And that's not what Edison did, That's not what Tesla did. And we make this guy out to be the modern day version of those men. And I'm just sort of fed up with the government putting these personas on us, and we're just supposed to take this type of imagery and accept it as reality. But I totally agree. So what I'm hearing is two things from Joseph. I agree. I'm completely suspicious of this guy doing the cloud seeding and then the rain's happening. But Joseph's saying also at the same time, we haven't had a flood of this type since 1924?
Well, let's go through a little bit.
If I may say one last thing, it reminds me of the Johnstown floods. Go look that story up. But that was a different story where a dam broke. And then again, the question becomes up, why did the dam break, right? It's just all these historical events I'm starting to rethink twice about now. I mean, I feel like we're reliving through the Johnstown floods. I'm sorry, but go ahead, please.
Okay, well, prior to any large-scale climate change manipulation, the worst natural disaster in the history of the United States was the 1927 flood of the Mississippi River. And what happened, it was an extra cold winter. There was an enormous ice pack that went from Idaho all the way over to Pennsylvania, which are the three major tributaries that feed into the Mississippi River. That's the Ohio River, the Missouri River, and the Mississippi River, which goes up into Canada. So that whole ice sheet started melting in the spring, and I believe it was around June of 1927. The flood was already hitting flood stage all the way down the Mississippi River, and it had made it down like as far as Nashville when a tropical storm came in off of the Gulf and sat over New Orleans. Okay, now this was not due to any kind of weather manipulation, but it flooded 10,000 square miles in 7 different states and killed 20,000 people. The largest disaster in American history.
What year was this again?
1927.
And what was the name of this flood?
The book that I read that covers it is called Rising Tide by John M. Barry, and it's an absolutely fabulous book. It goes through all of the failures of the Army Corps of Engineers to, quote, contain rivers. And what a wonderful engineer was able to do some really good things on the Mississippi River, a civil engineer named John Eads. But it's an interesting story. But bottom line is, you can look it up on Google, 1927 flood. It was 1/3 of the agricultural production of the whole United States. Coolidge was president. His Secretary of Interior was Hoover, not J. Edgar, the other Hoover that was President, Herbert Hoover. And so Hoover refused to do any kind of rehabilitation in the South, and they let Southern banks, railroads, and newspapers go bankrupt. And then when Hoover got in as president after Coolidge, he turned around and said, well, we need to rehabilitate the South because it's been down for several years. And so he gave virtually everything to J.P. Morgan for 10 cents on the dollar. So Morgan was able to double the size of his newspaper monopoly. He was able to add another 20% to his banking monopoly, and he was able to add another 20% to his railroad monopoly. And so that's how big government and these people work, and that's how they're operating today. And you have the same Robert Barron's, the creator of Facebook, never wrote a single piece of code in his whole life. He was given that by Larry Summers when he was a student dropout student at Harvard. And the same thing with Bill Gates. He stole his patents from Xerox.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a different age. We're told that this is the golden age. But jumping back to the Hill Country floods, why was this company seeding the clouds?
I don't know. We're not in a current drought at this point, but maybe they're just doing it to experiment because they got a contract from somebody who knows what. The Hill Country has been in a drought, and so there was low water level in all of the rivers in Texas. So maybe he got a contract from somebody in the state government. We'll never know because the governor has access to what's called the Enterprise Fund, which he has a slush fund, and he's not required to disclose who he's given the money to. So
G2,
we don't know that part.
Do you know? I'm sorry to interrupt. G2, do you know if there was a reason given as to why this guy was cloud seeding?
I never heard a legitimate reason given for that specific assignment to seed clouds in that specific area. What the gentleman said, this young boy said, is that his activity as cloud seeding is a critical activity that good Christians would take on, because it is their job to care for the earth, and by bringing additional rainfall to agricultural lands, they are maximizing the productivity of those lands. It is the thinnest, sort of hokiest kind of explanation you could give, but it reflects that he has absolutely no respect for the audience he's speaking to. No, I don't think they bothered to say who hired them, how they got paid, or why they were there. It's just this overarching narrative that good people seed clouds because that's what God would ask us to do. It was preposterous.
Is there any investigations being done into this by the state of Texas or by the federal government? Are any of our political representatives hunting down the truth for this on our behalf?
Not to my knowledge, but I tell you what, I know it's quite a few state representatives on a personal level. And now that you brought the subject up in that particular manner, that is an important thing to know. But another thing, the reason why the death toll was so high is because we recognize that we're subjected to all kinds of emergencies where people need to be notified. And so you have a cell phone voluntary thing, Amber Alert and Silver Alert. If some old person with Alzheimer's out driving around, they want to get them off the road. If some child gets kidnapped, they want to be able to apprehend the kidnapper and save the child. So in 2019, the state legislature passed House Bill 3022. This was approved by unanimous vote of 31-0 in the Senate. It was approved in the House by 146-0, with 2 people voting present instead of voting against it. This would be able to notify people with a text message of flooding, of tornadoes, and wildfires. And those are things that you're not necessarily going to know unless you're just stuck to the TV set all day long, because you're not getting these kind of alerts. And this was a voluntary system that would be based on individual counties. And so you could sign into it. Had that system been implemented in 2019, the death toll wouldn't have been 100. The death toll probably would have been a half dozen, because you would have been able to wake up the camp directors. They would have been able to notify their neighbors. People would start notifying all their friends and relatives that were in the area, and you would have been able to avert this particular disaster. But our governor said that he vetoed it because he was worried about people's privacy and them having their phone numbers available to the government. It's like, give me a break, Abbott.
How many people died?
The last count I got was over 100. There was estimates up to 130, but I really don't know what the count is today, because there's still 24 people that are missing somewhere in the debris. And those skeletons may float up. Who knows? They may be,
How fast did the water come down?
I don't think it was a real severe rain. I think it was only like at 6 or 8 inches. But there again, if you're concentrating that in a valley and you get 6 inches on the top of the ridge and it has to flow down 1,000 feet, well, next thing you know, you've got 20 feet, and it was rising rapidly. One of the girls, the one girl that was the only survivor from the cabins that washed away at Camp Mystic, said that the water started coming into the cabin, and so the camp counselor, obviously untrained, said, well, everybody needs to get on the top bunk. And then within 10, 15 minutes, it was chest deep and the top bunks weren't safe. And they said, well, now we need to get out of the cabin. Well, you can wade through ankle-deep water even if it's moving pretty fast, and especially if you're holding hands and stabilizing each other. All of those kids could have been moved out. But when they were held there until it was shoulder deep and it's dark and it's cold and you've got no orientation, it's really hard to be able to survive. And this girl just happened to be in a tree and got rescued the next morning. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that the camp knew there was a possibility of this, and you can go on Amazon, and for $79 you can get a high water alarm that you can put in your basement or you can put in the bilge of your boat, and it's float activated. It operates on 12 volts or it operates on 110. It has a 110 decibel alarm, and it will tell you and a flashing light, and it will tell you when you've got a high water condition. It would have been simple enough for the managers of that site to say, we want to protect our girls. We're going to put a high water alarm down at the lowest point in our camp, and when that alarm goes off, we're going to all move to higher buildings. So bottom line is, every tragedy can be prevented, but it's better to prevent it ahead of time, and that's why we try to be proactive about this stuff. And it's really disappointing that the state legislature was able to vote something in that was veto-proof. The governor vetoed it, didn't call a special session to reintroduce it. It wasn't reintroduced at a later session because our legislature meets for 5 months every 2 years. It's an absolutely absurd method of governing a state this size.
Back on subject, weather modification. Is there any additional information that you have about this subject in general?
Oh, yeah, they're chemtrailing the heck out of the planet. I disagree with Dale Wigington about a lot of things, but he's one of the most foremost people investigating chemtrails, and they're absolutely 100% doing that, and that is spraying us with aluminum, barium, strontium, and a whole bunch of stuff, and now it looks like they're adding mRNA and spraying us with that.
Who's doing this?
It's being done under contracts, but it's by private planes and the U.S. Air Force. And there's plenty of evidence about.
And why do is there any agency here that we can call on to have this stopped?
You could try to call your people in Congress and say, have them stop that. About the only ones that are making any noise about it are Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Apparently, there's enough people in Congress that really don't care if there's no future life. They're sort of in the same bandwagon with the rest of the global warming clowns, and they think that, well, if it's weather modification, it's reflecting the sunlight back and it's keeping our carbon dioxide from warming the planet. Well, that's completely absurd, and we've proven it repeatedly. I've written over 100 articles starting at InfoWars back in 2009 about how it's physically impossible for a carbon dioxide 3-atom molecule to capture, store, redirect, or amplify radiant energy photons moving at the speed of light. So bottom line is, anything that happens in the atmosphere cools the Earth. There's nothing in the atmosphere that can warm the Earth. What it does is it cools the Earth by day when the sun's shining on it, and then it delays warming by keeping the radiant energy from being able to bounce out into space real fast, which keeps us warmer at night. But delayed cooling is not warming. And that's the point that you need to understand.
And what's keeping the temperature fluctuated? What is it that you're referring to?
Well, you have what's called the lapse rate. For every 1,000 foot of altitude you go up, and you can verify this anytime you get on an airplane and you watch the thermometer as you're rising in the air, you lose 3 degrees centigrade, 4 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 foot of altitude. And that means anywhere in the atmosphere, over any portion of the Earth, the atmosphere is cooler. And you cannot radiate heat from a cooler position to a warmer. A human being at 98.6 emits electromagnetic radiation in the 10 micron range, which is why you're visible with an infrared camera. But you cannot take a mirror and take your 10 microns, reflect it back on your body, and raise your body up to 11 microns. You can't do that because heat transfer is a one-way vector, always going from a hotter to a cooler. And so there's nothing in the atmosphere that can warm the surface of the Earth. But like I said, because there's so many molecules, you've got that mass between you and the void of outer space, you're able to delay the infrared signal coming out of the Earth by being absorbed into the atmosphere and gradually warming the atmosphere at night from the energy that's coming off the Earth.
G2, do you have an opinion on chemtrails?
Well, I can tell you that if you looked up in the sky decades ago, you would see cirrus clouds, you'd see cumulus clouds, you'd see fog occasionally. But never did we see silver shrouds appear. Never did we see aircraft that didn't just trail a contrail, some moisture that would dissipate, but rather trails that would last for miles and miles, and long after the plane was far gone, these trails would still be there, and they'd be spreading until we had that silver shroud in the sky. Now, they continue, they being the government and the people that do these sorts of things, continue to say, if you think there are chemtrails, you're being silly. You're being a conspiracy theorist. But there is clearly something that has changed in our sky. And we've had people like Bill Gates explaining that they are desperate to do this, that they want to block the sun, that they want to change the atmosphere, that they want to take control of what's happening in our sky. So, just looking at it without digging deeply into the facts, just looking at the evidence in the sky above, you've got to ask questions. You've got to say, what's changed? Why suddenly do contrails last for hours and hours and hours? They get deposited now, not a little bit behind a jet, but rather in a hex pattern, a crosshatch pattern, that then spreads until the sky is an endless shroud of silver. It makes no sense. So I think that there is absolutely something happening in that atmosphere, that someone is spreading it. I don't know exactly how. I'm not, I've heard it's in the jet fuel. I know that there are aircraft that were designed decades ago by the Air Force to spread material in the sky. But you have to start asking these kinds of questions when you see the world around you changing and no explanations being given, and anyone who asks the question is ridiculed.
Yep. Joseph, what more you got for us?
The fact that they're doing it in a grid pattern is really curious too, because airplanes don't normally fly in grid patterns. They normally go from one point to another, and those points are usually spoked instead of being grids. So that's item number one. Item number two, I grew up in the 50s when a jet airplane flew over our elementary school, which we didn't have air conditioning, so we were very aware of what was going on outside. We would run to the windows, and the contrails were usually only like 4 or 5 times the length of the jet. And so that's condensation from burning of hydrocarbon jet fuel, which is Jet A. It's a type of kerosene. When you burn it, the two byproducts are carbon dioxide and water vapor. And the water vapor, when you're at 50,000 feet, the air temperature is like minus 50 degrees. So it condenses into little ice particles, or if you're lower than that, it can condense into water molecules that are visible, but they dissipate rather rapidly. So the fact that they are able to not only be spread in a grid pattern, but that the grid pattern would spread out and completely cover the whole sky is a telltale sign that this is something that's being man-made, created, with no benefit to anybody that's on Earth.
Well, here we are. Okay, well, Joseph, I know we're in our last part of the show here. Do you want to talk about HAARP?
HAARP is a series of antennas, and you can look this up. It was built in Alaska, and they were picking up signals. I believe it was called the woodpecker signals from Russia, and they thought Russia was trying to do some form of hacking into our military radio frequencies. And so they built this big antenna to be able to monitor where it was coming from and what it was being done. And so that's when they figured out that they could actually heat the ionosphere. And like I said, you have the linear coefficient of expansion for metals in particular, but almost everything expands when the temperature increases, because the molecules get pushed further or further apart because they're more excited. Well, the same thing happens in the atmosphere, except that the volume change is enormous. And like I said, put a half-filled bottle or just put an empty bottle in your refrigerator and watch how much the bottle shrinks just from that 30-degree difference between your room temperature and the 45, 50 degrees that's inside your refrigerator. And so if you're able to heat up the upper part of the atmosphere, you can make it push down and push currents away from where that high pressure is sinking because you built a whole lot of extra air. That's a whole lot of extra mass, and then that produces pressure on top of the other atmospheric layers and directs them. And so that's what they were able to do. And these are directional antennas. They're set up on a four-way grid, and so it's kind of like a flat plane radar antenna. I'm trying to remember the exact name for those, but
What's
anyway,
the purpose of it?
The purpose was to see if they could push weather fronts, and it would be something that they were hoping that if the storm was fixing to come over the battlefield, you could push the weather over and make it rain. The Chinese were able to make it completely clear when they had the Olympics in Beijing because they used that same radio frequency technology to push rain clouds away from Beijing so that they could have the Olympics. And they've readily admitted that they did that.
So, does HAARP still exist?
They turned it over to the University of Alaska, but that's only because they built dozens of other locations around the country and around the world.
So HAARP is the original beta version, or I want to say not beta version, but original version of this weather modification.
Yes.
G2, are you familiar with HAARP?
H-A...
Well,
Okay.
HAARP. Go ahead.
HAARP.
And for years we were told there is no such machine. It doesn't exist. Again, it's a conspiracy theory. This is just simply not real. And then one day, the Air Force hands it over to the University of Alaska, and they say, of course it's real. What do you think? We weren't doing that the whole time. And it's just like they do this with every story. So it is real. It is now visible on Wikipedia, right? It's not hidden at all. And it was created for that purpose. Now, there's another element that I think may be useful today, which are these directed energy weapons. And again, for a long time we were told those are the thing of science fiction. But if you look at the major military contractors today, you can find references to directed energy weapons on their websites, and they'll say these are available for deployment on any platform, meaning aircraft, meaning mobile units on the ground. Directed energy weapons are another way to put concentrations of energy into a specific point for a specific purpose. It could be to destroy something. Could those also be used to modify the weather?
Well, it looks like that's what they did in Maui, in Pacific Palisades, to campfire fires in California. So it looks like they're certainly able to do that. And it's really odd that you have fires in locations where it burns and melts the granite countertops, melts the stainless steel appliances, melts the cars, and right next to the house there's shrubbery that still has green leaves on it. So how does that happen? Definitely.
Well,
go ahead.
And that's why in Lahaina, in Maui, they put a black curtain up around the area that was burned, and they were arresting people that were stopping to take photographs or video of the scene. It's because they didn't, why would you do that? Why is it so critical that we not see that? And there's quite a curious thing happening with these wildfires now year after year in Canada, which is that if you watch satellite imagery, you'll see across a span of maybe, call it 1,000 miles, you'll see large numbers of fires start simultaneously. Now, how does that happen? Simultaneously, they spontaneously combust. It makes no sense if there isn't some energy being directed into those areas that are starting those fires. Either that means somebody on the ground doing something or some other technique. Have you looked at those simultaneously erupting fires in Canada?
Well, and there again, we get back to certain conditions that exist in the planet. Wildfires have been typical, and particularly along the Cascades, and that's an area where you have a little bit of outgassing from methane, and you also have rocks that are able to produce piezoelectric sparks. And so even if you didn't have a lightning strike, you could have a piezoelectric start at a place where there was a venting of methane and it happened to be under a bunch of dried out tree leaves. And next thing you know, you've got the same thing in the Bible, the burning bush. Well, it's sitting there burning for days because it's sitting on top of a methane vent and it just happened to catch on fire. So there's certainly natural conditions that can create and sustain these things, that we're not fully aware of because people just aren't looking at it.
But the chances of it being natural are incredibly slim. If I'm right, correct?
Well, and then also fire was used extensively by the Native Americans to drive buffalo herds off of cliffs, to clear areas to plant farm crops, used in warfare. So bottom line is, I think it's George Washington that said fire is a helpful servant but a terrible master, something like that. And it's like, yeah, it can really be something that's really destructive.
But simultaneously erupting fires across thousands of miles over and over again, not 1 year, year after year.
Yeah.
It begs the question, how are all these fires starting at exactly the same moment in time?
Well, yeah, you start running out of coincidences. I like the Ian Fleming quote, once is a happenstance, twice is a coincidence, and three times is a state action. And so he's the one that wrote the James Bond novels, and he was a former MI6 guy, so I think he pretty much knows what he's talking about. If it happens three times in a row, kids, it's something that's state action.
Well, I think we covered everything very, very thoroughly. Any other final thoughts on weather modification in the Hill Country floods?
Gosh, I wish I had a few more. I'm sure I'll think of a bunch of them on the way back home. But.
Okay, well, because I'll close it out this way. If you don't mind, Joseph,
yes.
Did you have something else you want to say? Because I could close that out a different way if you like.
No, that's cool. Go ahead.
Okay, so an incredible discussion, but I just want to share with the audience one more thing. In the studio prior to the show, Joseph was sharing with me technologies that have been discovered in the 1960s that regenerate the growth of limbs. And there's another truth or theory, conspiracy theory, whatever you want to call it, called the med beds. And it is this concept where the government has this technology to regenerate your body, to regrow limbs, to cure cancer, cure different ailments. It's just an amazing technology. And I study all these theories. I don't care what kind of name you call me. I will study the theory. I've never been able to find anything to confirm this theory until now, which we're not going to get into it tonight. We'll do another show on it. But Joseph was telling me that in the 1960s, there was a doctor who was able to basically confirm this ability to regrow limbs and things of that sort. Just give us 2 minutes on it, Joseph.
Yes, sir. Okay, this is a program that I did for Coast to Coast AM back in November of 2020, and it's based on a book called Body Electric by Robert O. Becker, who is an orthopedic surgeon at University of VA Hospital at Syracuse University. And he was able to do regeneration of lost limbs on lab rats in 1965. They could decorticate the spine and regrow it, and it's all based on using milliamp and millivolt DC currents running through your motor and sensory nerve circuits. Extremely interesting material, and we'll be doing a future show on that. But I highly recommend my article is a book review, Body Electric Secrets, and it's at Principia Scientific International, or you can look up principia-scientific.org or .com. And the name of the article, again, is Body Electric Secrets. You should be able to find it just by Googling that particular title and then either my name or Principia Scientific. It's a really well-read article, and it's really well written. But he ran into a problem because he was saying that there's that same interference from high-tension high-tension power transmission and radio waves. And the DOD, who happens to be the one in charge of all health spending in the United States, they're the parent organization over NIH, they said that it's okay if you want to regrow, some guy's broken spinal column, but we're not going to let you put Motorola and General Electric out of business. And so they defunded him in 1965, and he got around to writing his book in 1985. But it's really a great book, and it's a great subject, and I think a lot of people will be interested in knowing how your body actually works and how a salamander can regrow a whole half of its head if it's cut off, how planaria can grow 4 planarias if you cut it in 4 pieces. A starfish can grow 5 starfishes from being cut in pieces. But if you cut off your finger, you have a hell of a time regrowing just that finger. but that technology existed in 1965.
That's going to be an incredible episode. We will have you back for that episode, and I can't wait to hear about it. And that's it, guys. I appreciate everyone. G2, any final thoughts before we cut out?
There are a lot of questions to ask. There are a lot of answers we need, and it's important that we keep exploring things, even if they seem unlikely, because often we find out, like with the HAARP machine, what's unlikely is sometimes real.
Yep. We have more questions than answers.
Stay curious.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, this is Chris Heasley with the Chris Heasley Radio Show. On Thursday night, we will be covering everything Harris County, everything Houston, Texas, from a political landscape. So we hope you can tune in Thursday at 7. Have a great week.